Josh Martin,
Hello.
thanks for joining me today.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm happy to be on.
Yeah, can you give a little background about yourself and what you did prior to launching your podcast, Indubitably?
Hmm.
In fact, you know, when I was told about Indubitably, kind of ran off my tongue really well, and then all of a sudden it's like, hey, I remember cartoon characters, somebody, those chipmunks that used to say Indubitably.
Yep, that's it. Well, we were looking for sound bites for our little intro to the podcast, and that's one of the things we considered, but yeah, we went a different route.
Yeah. Well, before we talk about your podcast debate, because that's what your podcast is really about is debate. Can you
Hmm.
give a little history, a little bit background about yourself, what you did before this, and the launch of your podcast, and then we'll talk about what is debate.
Sounds
Are we
good.
going to argue about this or what?
Well, if you'd like to argue, I prefer the term debate, but if you want to argue, we could do that too. I
Yeah,
actually,
and that's what I want to make sure that people know that it is an argument, but it isn't because it's a planned thing and it's really structured. So it's not really the argument that you have with your parents or husband, wife, boyfriend, girlfriend, whatever it might be. It's different.
exactly, but it can
So
help you win those.
I bet it can.
So I started with debate myself when I was in university. And when I was there, my partner and I ended up winning the national championships. And after that, I was lucky enough to turn what had become my passion into a teaching career. So I've been fortunate enough to travel around the world teaching debate, which is a pretty amazing experience. I get to go to different countries and interact with people and cultures, which I think is especially rewarding through an activity that lets us really examine and get to know each other's worldviews and beliefs.
Yeah, I could have never imagined that there's a possibility of going around the world. I mean, the U.S. or even your local area, let alone the world, traveling and teaching debate.
And I think it speaks to some of the benefits that you get from it. And when you're in university, it's a great skill to start, and it's applicable later on in your personal life. It's applicable in your career. It's applicable outside just society in general, engaging in politics. So, obviously I'm biased, but I'm really happy that a lot of the schools and places around the world are seeing the value in it.
Yeah, you mentioned politics and debate. It's huge right now for presidential debates, during election time. But I think, in fact, the first televised debate was, correct me if I'm wrong, it was between Nixon and JFK, I think.
And
But I believe that was the first televised debate. So,
And that had a lot of implications come with it when people were able to see the person they were voting for, very different than just listening to them.
was this your initial interest when you went to school, when you went to university, or did something change to make you fall in love? I don't know if that's the right term with debate.
I wish I had a better story behind it, but I started debate. I just got lucky. I needed to take a public speaking class. None of the introduction to public speaking classes fit my schedule. So my counselor suggested I took this debate class. I did it, and that was it. I wish I could say I was super involved in politics as a kid or wanted to make the world a better place, but I just needed to fulfill my GE requirements.
So you were never an argumentative type of a person, never wanted to be right all the time, right?
Well, okay, that part might be true. I'm definitely argumentative, so I think I fell into it pretty naturally. But definitely a little bit of luck happening to sign up for the class, and maybe matched up a little bit with my personality.
Do you think that somebody who does have that type of a personality is more suited for debate, or can you be taught to be a good debater?
I actually think, and we can talk about this a bit later as well, sometimes that argumentativeness can be a disservice because one of the most important skills in debate is just the ability to listen. And sometimes people that are always out there trying to prove their point don't end up listening to the other side, and they don't have a real debate versus what we talked about earlier, just an argument. And so I think that it can help you win, but it might not help you achieve some of the other benefits from the activity that I think are probably more important in the long run.
Which is very true, because whether it's an argument for the sake of arguing or a debate, you want to come out in the end as being able to prove your point and be right. I'm gonna guess. So
Yeah.
yeah, listening is a big thing about winning. about any of this, whether it's an argument or a debate.
Right. And what's interesting is people usually, when they find out I teach debate, I do communication consulting in general. Debate is a big part of that. They assume I must be super opinionated. But actually, the more that I've been involved in the activity and the more subject matters I've debated, the less opinionated I've become. Because you start to realize that there are valid sides to every one of these arguments on every one of these issues. And so it actually kind of softens your stances oftentimes rather than making them more rigid.
That might be a little bit different from a psychiatrist. When you go out with a psychiatrist, they're always going to be psychoanalyzing you and second guessing. So it's good to know that once you become a debater at the level that you are at, and like you said, it softens up things. You don't jump the gun to assume things.
Correct.
I would imagine that you do listen and you do want to get both sides or all sides of the story.
Yeah, and I like that you make that distinction too. It's something we're picky about on the podcast. It's not both sides. I think particularly in the U.S., we have the left, the right, Democrats, Republicans, and we have a tendency to divide issues into two sides. But most of these issues are so much more multifaceted than that. And I think that's one of the other things that's important, to listen to all the voices that are out there on any particular issue and not just try to break it down into black and white, left versus right.
Yeah, so often now there are those massive gray areas where if you were to divide it up into a pie, like you said, it's not a 50% black, a 50% white. It's not split down the middle, and you can't say it's a 1/3. You can almost say, it's a quarter this, it's 10% that, but there's that gray area is so large in the pie. So I know that I'm going to be jumping all over the place in this podcast, so I hope you don't mind.
No, it's fine.
And because I really enjoy listening to all the different topics of debate that you have on your podcast. Can you kind of give a brief description of how a debate works in a formal environment, and then maybe like an informal, meaning that if you're just going out there and having a conversation, and if it's an argument but you don't want to have an argument and you want to have it be more of a debate,
right?
Without coming out saying to the person, okay, we're not arguing, we're going to debate on this. So
I think the first thing that you need to do is you need to decide what the purpose of the debate is. And I think that probably breaks down into two basic areas. So what you get out of it is going to change pretty drastically depending on what you're trying to accomplish with it. If you're at a debate tournament, you're there to win. If you're running a political campaign, a presidential debate you listed earlier, you're there to win. And a lot of times that means that you're not necessarily going to give the other side the benefit of doubt. You're going to maybe be a little bit disingenuous with some of your arguments. Maybe you know where they break down, but you're not going to point that out. You're going to, if the other person can bring it up, good for them. If not, you're going to let it slide through. One of the criticisms of presidential debates is how often they avoid the questions. And these are all things that happen if you're just trying to win a debate. So if that's your goal, this is where we need judges, because the judge's job is to sort of sift through that. So it's important to realize in that instance, you're not debating trying to convince the person you're debating against. You're trying to convince that third party, and that could change how you approach it. On the other side, when you talk about maybe a debate as opposed to an argument with your family, maybe it's a spouse, maybe it's somebody at work, you're debating about how to approach a project that you have, then the idea is that we're supposed to be trying to find common ground. And so instead of trying to run to the extremes and find ways of beating the other side, you're looking to work towards the middle to find the best solution that you can. So sure, you have your side of the issue that you'd like the solution to lean towards, but you should be open to compromise and finding areas where you can include solutions that cater to the concerns of the other party.
Okay. I think about that as a meeting of the minds, joining of the minds. So like you said, some sort of compromise. And this is where it becomes a great benefit to people to understand how to debate. So how would somebody like me be taught that, or how would I approach something like that?
First of all, I think you want to establish, it's like a negotiation. You want to establish what your goal is, right? This is what we're trying to accomplish. And you also want to establish some of your bottom lines. Here's the areas where we're not willing to compromise. So as we debate each other and we start to shift each other's positions, you want to have in your mind, this is my end goal, and these are lines I'm not willing to cross. And then make sure that you're open to the other areas where you can compromise, you can kind of give and take a little bit with the other side. After that's done, I think it's also important to understand the same thing for the people you're debating against. What are their goals? And a lot of times it's, people have goals that are more similar than they would think coming into a debate. And realizing that, I think, can help you. You're doing this in front of a judge. You're trying to convince the judge, showing that you're looking to the goals of your opponent and trying to incorporate them as well as your own is very persuasive for a third party that's listening. It shows you're the reasonable one. And if you're trying to convince the person that you're debating against, it also goes a really long way for them to truly believe that you're not just trying to get whatever you want for yourself, but you are trying to find the best solution that gives them a little bit of what they're looking for as well.
I'm just thinking about sometimes with discussions, and you might ask somebody point blank, so what do you want? And their answer is, I don't know. So what happens when you come across that situation where, you've laid out in front of them, you're having a discussion, which is a debate that it's turning into debate, and you say, well, these are the things that I want, and these are the things that I'm not willing to budge on. What do you want? And they say, I don't know. What do you do then?
Well, this is a benefit, and this is my career. So I think about this all the time. And when I interact with different people, this is the mindset that I'm in. And I think that's one of the skills that debate fosters in people is, again, when you're listening to people and you're approaching them with empathy, you're starting to understand where they're coming from. Oftentimes you might be able to identify goals for them that they haven't identified for themselves. And if you're in a discussion or you're in a debate and you're able to outline that and say, hey, I can feel we have some differences here, but at the end of the day, I think that we both want what's right for our family. We both want what's right for our company. If it's in politics, we both want what's right for the country. Some of the best presidential debates we've had, I can harken back to Obama versus McCain. And there was a lot of discourse out in society that were trying to pit the two against each other. But when they were debating, McCain, I remember saying very clearly, hey, I don't agree with him on most anything, but I trust that he has the best interests of our country in mind. And so having that common ground and recognizing goals, even if they don't recognize it themselves, but if they think you're debating in good faith, it goes a long way to helping you come to a solution.
One thing I just took away from that's huge is finding that common ground. So it almost sounds like being a debater or being in debate, there's a lot of human psychology behind it as well, understanding the person.
Any kind of communication, just basic rhetoric. The first rule, and this would be for a podcast too, I'm sure you're great at this whether you realize it or not, is knowing your audience. When you're communicating, it's less about what you say and it's more about what the audience hears. So if you can't put yourself in their mindset, it's really difficult to communicate with them effectively.
Yeah. This already is very, very informative. So I want to make sure that people know where they can go to listen to your podcast as well, because like I said at the top of the show, I thoroughly enjoyed some of the episodes that I listened to in your podcast.
I really appreciate that. We're actually on pretty much all of the podcast platforms. So you could find us Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google, etc. We're at Indubitably. We call ourselves The Debate Podcast, which is a little bit presumptuous, but that's the title we went with.
I'm going to suggest that the listeners and viewers really go to your podcast because it is great. And it's a fantastic way to listen to how people approach topics, subjects for discussion. Now, going back to you again and in debate, and you had mentioned that sometimes folks who are argumentative are not often, or it can be a hindrance. So can you expand a little bit on that, where, you would think that somebody that always likes to argue is going to be a great debater or a great attorney, but oftentimes it's a hindrance.
Right. Maybe the best way to do this would be with an example. If we had a debate, say a big issue right now is climate change. And if we had a debate between an environmental activist and, say, a coal miner, the initial assumptions are a big deal here. So say the coal miner is debating and says, I think that we should continue to support the fossil fuel industry. Of course, the environmental activist isn't going to like that. And they might fill in, if they're argumentative and they're just looking to win, they might fill in assumptions of what they think the coal miner means by that and say, you don't believe in climate change, you don't want to work towards green technology, you're not worried about sustainability. And they're building up what we call a straw man. You're putting up a weak version of the arguments to attack rather than dealing with the arguments themselves. And if they listened, it's possible that the coal miner says, hey, I'm worried about my family. This is the only career that I know. And if we don't have support for the fossil fuel industry, if the mine that I work at shuts down, I don't know how I'm going to feed my children. I don't know how I'm going to afford healthcare. And he's not saying any of the things that this activist assumed that he was going to say. And so at the end of that debate, we have a completely unproductive discussion where nobody actually addressed the real concerns, or like we talked about, either the real goals of the other party. And that's where the argumentative people, sometimes they like to talk more than they like to listen. And oftentimes that leads to them missing the point.
Okay, that makes sense. 100%. Yeah. Now, going back to you again, early in your career, this is going back to college and stuff, when you first started doing this, it's what do you do to prepare, or even now, what is it that you do to prepare as a debater? I know that topics are selected ahead of time and you research, but is there anything in particular that you have to do to prepare for this?
Actually, depending on the type of debate that you do, the topics aren't always given ahead of time. So the activity, the format that I competed in, you would show up to the tournament and they would announce the topic 15 minutes before the debate started. And so you're not allowed to use the internet. You would go off, it's all doubles, so you would have a partner. You'd go off with your partner, you'd talk about what you want to say. And if it's an issue you don't know anything about, you're in trouble. And so this is one of the other benefits of debate. A lot of times I get that not everybody's like me and interested in politics or these issues. Sometimes it can be boring, dates and names and facts. And debate and that competitive element can tap into a little bit of, hey, I want that trophy. I want the results. I want a ranking. And it can incentivize you to start researching things that you might not, or reading things, listening to podcasts, things that you wouldn't have otherwise. So the most important thing you can do is just become engaged with the world around you, what's going on, what the issues are, problems that people are facing, other countries. And, that goes a long way towards giving you the ability to talk about them.
Inadvertently, this is what a couple of friends of mine and I used to do, 10 or 15 years ago. And we made a game of it and never thought about it as a debate. But what we would do is we'd meet once a week for a beer, but we'd get there. And the purpose of us meeting was to have a discussion on the news that happened that week prior. But we would not pick out any topics. It would be one of us would throw out, hey, I read this in the paper and this is what I think. And we would give our opinions about it. So I can see where it could be something healthy if people get together and do this. And then pretty soon it's going to, I would think it would help them to be able to listen to people and to intelligently respond and to come to some sort of meeting of the minds.
Right.
So I guess what I'm getting at is, can you turn this into a learning experience and a game for everybody and anybody to do? Is a debate party, if you want to call it that.
Absolutely. I've been trying to learn Spanish, and it can be tedious to learn a language. It's very difficult, very daunting. And this is not like an advertisement, I just happen to be on it. I'm on Duolingo, and it does a really good job of gamifying the learning process. And it gives you a little streak. How many days in a row are you going? And because of that, I have this urge to come back to it, where if it was just the language, or for our conversation, if it was just, hey, let's look at the politics of Great Britain, I'm not sure how consistent I would be week after week listening to it. But if I know I have a tournament and I've got a trophy on the line, I'm much more motivated to do that.
You sparked an interest in me to go out there and find friends to do this with, have that conversation, have debates, healthy communication, really, especially this past couple of years, with the separation from people, the isolation and things like that. I think this would be a great way to reconnect with your friends, make new friends, and to have healthy discussions, is to learn to debate and learn to do this. With your podcast, Indubitably, has there been a favorite episode that you've done, a favorite debate topic?
I have a couple. So we look to explore controversial topics, and some of the ones are things you would typically think of, like gun control or vaccine mandates. And those are great, and that's what people think about when they think debate. But some of my favorite ones are subject matter that you might not expect, things like dating apps. How does dating apps compare with traditional dating? What are the benefits and drawbacks of that? Or we did a Halloween special where given the fact that the zombie apocalypse is inevitable, would you rather be a zombie or a human? And it seems like a silly topic at first, but as we go through this discussion, it really turns into us examining what does it mean to be human? And what parts of ourselves would we be willing to lose and still want to carry on? Or at what point do we just give up and say, I've sacrificed so much of what I think it means to be human that I would rather just be a zombie?
Do you remember what episode that is? Because I want to
That was October 31st, I think. So it was our Halloween special. But some of those topics, I think it gets people thinking in ways that they might not, and it gets them seeing controversies. And we did an episode about food that the title is Pineapple on Pizza, but I promise we went beyond that. And looking at traditionalism when it comes to, the culinary arts versus, people that are looking to innovate and where on the balance we should lie. And it's not something I ever would have considered was a controversy, but people that are involved, chefs, people involved in the food industry, it's a big deal for them.
I see threads on certain postings about, should pineapple be on pizza, or should pineapple be mixed with pepperoni and things like that? And some will say, no, that sweet and spicy is the best taste. And others say, no way. How can you do that?
I did get a lot of hate after I said that I was pro pineapple.
There's some of these other topics I want to bring up that you had discussions. You're a Nazi science. Is it wrong to use discoveries? That one was very, very interesting. So if people want to check something out, it was one back on July 24th. So
that was one of our more recent ones. And kind of the discussion you and I are having right now, we try to split our episodes between conversations where my co-host, our guests, and I will come together and really examine a topic where the three of us will float back and forth together, talking about arguments on one side, the other side, like we said, all sides. And then some episodes like that one, we have a competitive debate and we're actually given more structure. I'll speak for 6 minutes, they'll speak for 6 minutes. And depending on the topic, the subject area, sometimes we feel as though it's more conducive to have a conversation about it. And sometimes we feel it's more conducive to kind of go at each other with it.
Yeah, which I found very interesting on that one, where I did not think that I would like a structured debate type of situation. It made sense, and enjoyable might not be the right word because of the topic, subject matter, but it was enlightening to listen to different sides of the story. And then it really caused me as a listener to think and understand where different people are coming from. But it was an awful difficult decision on what would I decide on.
That's one of the hard parts about debate. If it matters the most when the subject material is the deepest or impacts people the most seriously. And when it's something that can literally change your lives, or in some cases end your life, if you have an opinion on that, you're not going to want to compromise. If you really think that what you believe is the right thing to believe and the impacts are that great, it can be very challenging to come together with somebody else that disagrees and have a healthy discussion. We see that, I think gun control we mentioned earlier is a perfect example of that. And obviously there's some other issues that are going on right now where people believe these are matters of life and death. And they look to the other side and they see the other side as a group of people that are making decisions to end somebody else's life or put somebody else's life in danger. And it's super challenging to come and have a dialogue with somebody if that's your opinion of them.
I've experienced some things very similar to what you're saying. And it starts out as a debate, but it can quickly turn into an argument. And it seems like it's more so if it's not in a formal debate situation. It almost seems like if you're not a debater, or if you are so entrenched in your own way of thinking that this has to be the way, it seems like it inevitably becomes an argument because possibly one side of the party or the one side of the person is turning it into that. I don't know. I'm thinking about this. When you're pointing at somebody, there's always those fingers pointing back at you. But hopefully you and the listeners understand what I mean by sometimes your intent is to have a good discussion or debate about that topic. But inevitably, if it's just a friend or somebody else, it turns into an argument, a straight out argument. And then there's no way out other than to say,
right.
Okay.
Sometimes it's better not to have the discussion if you're not ready for it. But the more you debate, the more you develop a level of discipline. And you asked earlier, what are some of the things you can do to be a more effective debater? And that level of discipline is one of them, right? Staying firm on, we're trying to have a civil discussion here because we're trying to find the best solution, and forcing yourself not to devolve into that kind of emotional state where you start attacking the other person personally. Ad hominem attacks is what we call them. So that level of structure or discipline is even challenging for me sometimes. On our podcast, we make a commitment that we want to cover all of the arguments on all sides. And that means sometimes I'll be saying things that I don't necessarily agree with, but I've committed to the process, and I try, not saying we always succeed, but try to stay disciplined enough to give arguments that I don't believe, but have value and have credible logic and evidence behind them, give them the airtime that they deserve.
Yeah, and the two words that really jump out to me is emotion. Like you said, a lot of people let their emotions get into it, but you got to be logical as well. You know, log and prosper. Like your character spy, right. It's like logic, and sometimes you need to stick with that. Are there subjects that you should try to stay away from? You'd mentioned gun control and things like that, but out there in general, would you say there are certain things that you should just stay away from? Religion,
right?
Politics, or are those the top? To me, those are the fun and interesting things where I can learn from others. But are there topics that you really should stay away from that is just
so
not
I'm
appropriate?
biased. I run a debate podcast, so I'm going to say no. But I was thinking about this actually when you were talking earlier, you and your friends meeting at the bar, and that's either a great idea for a bit of lubrication to the conversation, or a horrible idea to get people arguing with alcohol involved. But if you look to other countries in Europe, for example, meeting at the pub, meeting at the bar, having discussions on politics is just the norm. And there isn't this sense of, like you said, avoid religion and avoid politics. People grew up doing that. And so they've kind of learned the rules of when you're crossing a line, what you're allowed to say, when you're pushing things too far. In the US, we don't have that. We have the opposite, where there are these taboo subjects. And so, realizing that that is the case, there's definitely people out there that would probably appreciate you avoiding certain topics. But if I were to be constructing my ideal world, I think that if we start teaching kids at younger ages how to debate, people can start developing their critical thinking skills around 12 years old. I think it's a great time to be getting involved in the activity. There's a lot of middle school debate leagues that are springing up now. It's becoming more and more prevalent as an activity. And I think if we have a culture that learns it young and learns how to do it respectfully and have that discipline, I don't see a reason why we can't have a culture, a country of adults who can sit at a pub and talk about anything and walk away not hating each other.
I agree on that. And I also wanted to ask you, and you kind of touched on this, is there was a point in time that you would see debate being made fun of, or debate being popular, however you want to view it, through movies. You would see these movies and they would be something about debate, whether it be the nerd in the debate or it's something centered around debate. But then all of a sudden you saw it drop off. There's no movies, no scenes about kids doing debate and stuff like that. I wanted to ask you, was there a drop-off point, and is it coming back now? Is debate something that's coming back?
I don't want to get too in-depth with the sort of semantics or the politics of debate. There's different formats, and the different formats of debate, again, prioritize different things. And so when debate becomes gamified and it's about winning tournaments, it becomes a little society of its own where debaters are speaking in a way that only other debaters understand. They start talking faster, they start using lingo, and they're not worried about persuasion. They're not worried about listening. They're worried about scoring points. And I think there's been a big shift towards that in competitive debate in schools. And so if there's an outsider who's never heard debate before and they listen, they just don't get it. It doesn't make sense to them. It doesn't translate. So I think as much as I'm saying that it's great that we're teaching debate in schools, we also have to be careful. And I think that it's important, like I started the episode with, to think about the purpose. And when the purpose becomes just to win and just to get trophies and just to put it on your resume, the activity starts to break down. When you're trying to have middle schoolers, high schoolers learn to debate so that they can engage with the world around them more effectively, worry about persuasion, learn how to listen to the people, learn how to communicate with their audience, I think it's an amazing activity. And if that's the focus, we're going to have more movies like The Great Debaters. I think it was Denzel Washington. Great movie.
Yeah. I'll tell you one of the first things that popped up in my mind for movies, and they did a poor job of debate because it was just winning, scoring points and to win. The Computer Who Wore Tennis
Oh my
Shoes.
gosh. Yeah.
Do you ever remember that?
And it's funny you say that. One of the people that I debated with and popular on the world circuit actually had the first debate against artificial intelligence recently. So debate is also something they're starting to train AI and train computers to try to debate. And I think it's a really interesting activity because it is so much about emotions and humanity and persuasion, which is not something you would typically think a computer could do. That's like the one thing we have over them. They'll try to, it's funny to listen to the computer try to be persuasive and try to make an argument tugging on your heartstrings. It's not effective yet. And just the computer trying to tap into something that is so human, like fear, anger, these sorts of revenge, any of these sorts of things. So spoiler alert, the human won this time, but we'll see how long that lasts for.
It makes sense because you're trying to emote in emotion. Like you said, tug at one's heart, and where I can see where a computer just talks in that monotone type of thing, and there's no emotion. You're going, well, I don't feel the fear from you about this, or I don't feel the sadness, so I don't believe this.
But the way things are developing, I'm certainly not going to be the one to say it's impossible that they'll be able to in the near future.
I agree with you, and that's a huge other topic as far as AI, especially with general AI, and that's the scary part. I mean, we have AI out there doing a lot of, manufacturing things, but with general AI,
and that's definitely something we did an episode on. That if the viewers are interested.
I'm looking for that one on general. I'm looking for that. I am seriously getting goosebumps because it can be frightening, but I also believe it is. It's inevitable. Maybe not my lifetime.
I think so.
Give it 200 years or maybe 100 years, and I think the general AI will be there. And for folks that don't know what general AI is, look it up with general AI, because there are different levels of different structures.
This is what leads to killer robots. That's the fear. And that's
right.
Again, that's an example of where it's the tech world, but we're going to have to debate about what to do. Do we pursue it? If it does come into existence, how do we regulate it? And these sorts of conversations, people are going to have opinions on them. They're going to feel very passionate about them. There's a lot of money to be had. There's potentially security concerns for it. And if we're not able to have productive conversations, we're going to be in a hole before we realize it. And, some of these, I'm not trying to be too doomsday here, but some of these scenarios, I'm not going to be the one to say that they can't come about.
I'm going to throw this out there because with general AI, my fear, my thought is we need to have our history, meaning human history, humankind, just to know where we have been. And we need to know and understand about slave labor and slavery, because when we get to that point of the general AI, and God and religion, we're the creators. Well, and then until they take over, are people going to look at these AI, these beings at that time as inferior? Or are we going to stipend them because we're afraid that they are superior, or we don't want them to get to a higher level? I mean, there's a lot of different implications as far as general AI and in the future of mankind. But that's going way off, isn't it?
Because there's some really fascinating principled or practical concerns, and it is related to debate, because how else do we decide what to do? There has to be a debate about how do we treat them. They are robots. So do we treat them as property? But then that comes with some pretty serious moral implications, like what you said, and some of the things we've done in the past. And so finding that balance, if we can't have a conversation about it, how do we decide?
Yeah, absolutely. This is fantastic. I just want to make sure that people are aware that they can go and they can find Indubitably, your podcast, on all the podcast channels, because there's a lot of great discussions, a lot of great topics, a lot of great debates on there. And definitely listening to your podcast, I feel as though you can learn from it. And what I mean by that is you can learn how to listen, and you can learn how to prepare, and you can learn how to have a good
Yeah,
discussion.
we hope to serve as a good example of practicing what we're preaching to everybody.
Do you personally offer services as far as how to listen, how to debate, how to
I do.
prepare
I do a bit of work
or
as a
anything like
communication
this?
consultant. So typically I'm guest lecturing at universities around the world. I do some work on political campaigns and with corporate clients. So I'm in that sphere. Most people personally aren't interested enough to take classes like that, but that's definitely the world that I work in.
Wow, this is fantastic. Josh, I mean, is there anything else that you could think of that you want to add to this podcast show right now
No, I
on the
think
subject
the
of
big thing
debate?
to reiterate is I think it's super important, just the way that society is moving forward, that we get better and better at listening to people. I think it's a skill that's degrading, and I think you can see just in the public discourse more and more it's turning into accusations, name calling, threats, and it's a road that I don't think we want to travel down, considering we have such big existential threats coming up. And if we're not able to have conversations like artificial intelligence, like climate change, any of these issues, if we can't have discussions on it, we're sort of dooming ourselves to failure. And I'm not trying to get depressing, but the big takeaway is hopefully give people that you disagree with the benefit of doubt. Really make an effort to listen to them rather than talking, and just try to be empathetic, see where they're coming from, see what their goals are. And I think you find that you aligned more often than not.
I hope you enjoyed this podcast with my guest, Josh Martin, host of Indubitably podcast. So please join me again for a future podcast and keep rating, liking, and sharing.